Hey everyone, have you ever thought about how we describe people, using just a few words?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Like easygoing or creative or even like serious.
Yeah, it's like we try to sum up someone's whole personality in just like a quick little label.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to be diving into today.
Ooh, I'm excited.
We're taking a deep dive into a podcast episode all about this called Understanding Personality Traits and Social Perspectives.
Okay, I like it.
It's from the series Exploring Personality, and it really gets into how these simple descriptions can be so revealing.
But they could also be kind of misleading sometimes too.
Right. Oh,
Yeah,
absolutely. That's a big part of what we're going to unpack today.
I get it.
It's like we're all playing this personality game,
Uh-huh.
but no one gave us the full rule book.
Oh, I like that analogy.
So to illustrate their point, this podcast uses these fictional characters, and I thought it was such a clever way to bring these ideas to life.
Oh, for sure. For
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, using examples always makes things so much clearer.
So they introduce this character, Donna, who everyone considers easygoing. Sounds pretty positive, right?
Yeah, flexible goes with the flow.
Exactly. But then they flip the script and they're like, okay, but imagine Donna's in a situation where she needs to be assertive,
Oh, interesting.
like negotiating a salary or standing up for herself.
Right, where being easygoing might not be the best approach.
Exactly. It's like
Yeah.
suddenly her biggest strength becomes a weakness. And it made me wonder, how often does that happen in real life?
All the time, I bet. We just don't always realize it.
Yeah. And it reminds me of this friend I had in college who was the epitome of easygoing.
Right. Yeah.
Everyone loved her. She was always up for anything.
Sounds fine.
But she would constantly get roped into doing favors for people
Oh, no.
because she had such a hard time saying no.
I know that type for sure. It's like they want to please everyone.
Right. And in the end, it kind of backfired on her,
Yeah, totally. It's like sometimes those traits we see as positive can have this shadow side.
It's like this podcast episode really made me reconsider all those snap judgments we make about people.
Based on just a word or two.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And speaking of snap judgments, let's shift gears and talk about the workplace.
Okay, love it.
So the podcast brings up this guy, Jason, and he's described as hardworking.
Hardworking.
Okay.
Solid.
And I think we can all agree that, in general, that's a good thing.
Right. Of course.
Yeah.
Who doesn't want a hardworking employee?
And then they bring up this whole idea of hustle culture.
Ah, yes. The
Right.
pressure to constantly be on.
Yeah. And they ask this really thought-provoking question. Could Jason's hardworking nature actually be masking something deeper?
Like what?
Like maybe a fear of failure, or maybe he's trying to live up to some impossible standard that he set for himself.
Makes you think.
Like maybe he doesn't even realize he's doing it,
Yeah, It's so easy to get caught up in that cycle, especially these days.
Right. And then the podcast highlights Irene, who's described as trustworthy and reliable.
Those are great qualities for sure, especially in a work setting.
Yeah, like gold star qualities.
Real.
But even with those seemingly positive traits, they're like, hold on a second. What if Irene's reliability comes from this deep-seated need to please everyone?
Ooh, interesting. Maybe she's afraid of letting people down?
Yeah. Or what if she's taking on way too much because she doesn't know how to say no?
That's a real struggle for a lot of people.
It makes me think about my own workplace. We definitely put a lot of value on initiative and proactiveness.
Yeah, those are buzzwords for sure.
But I wonder if sometimes it pushes people to take on more than they can handle, just to be seen as a go-getter.
It's a tricky balance for sure.
Right. And it kind of circles back to what we were talking about earlier. It's like we need to look beyond just the surface. These words we use to describe people: hardworking, trustworthy, reliable.
Yeah.
They're just the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly. There's so much more beneath the surface that shapes who we are.
It's like we're trying to read a book by only looking at the cover,
Yeah. You might get a general idea, but you're missing out on the whole story.
And that's where this deep dive gets really interesting. We're not just talking about words, we're talking about people.
Real people with complex lives.
Exactly. So as we go deeper into this podcast, I want you to think about the people you encounter every day.
Okay.
What words would you use to describe them?
I like that.
And what's the story behind those words?
That's a great question to keep in mind.
Okay, you've officially blown my mind. Let's move to the social side of things. The podcast uses Eric as an example of someone who's outgoing.
Okay, outgoing. Got it.
Which we often see as a positive trait, but it's not always that simple, is it?
Not necessarily. No, not at all, actually.
Right.
Or with anything else, you can have too much of a good thing.
Yeah. Too much of anything can be a bad thing.
Exactly. Like someone who's super outgoing could end up dominating conversations.
Oh, yeah.
Or even come across as insensitive.
Without even realizing it.
Exactly. It's like they're not even aware of the effect they're having on others.
It's like they're just so excited to share their own thoughts and experiences that they forget to, like, listen to other people.
Right. And then on the flip side, the podcast talks about Jared, who's described as serious.
Okay, serious. Got it.
And it's interesting how that same word can have such different meanings depending on the context.
Right. Serious could mean, like, thoughtful, responsible, focused.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it could also be perceived as uptight or even intimidating.
Or, like, they have no sense of humor.
Yeah. That's all about perception.
It's like we use these personality words to kind of put people in these boxes.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like, if you're outgoing, you must be the life of the party.
And if you're serious, you must be a total stick in the mud.
Exactly. But real life is way more complicated than that, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like one of the biggest takeaways for me from this podcast is that we need to challenge those assumptions we make about people.
Just based on a label.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because those labels could be so limiting.
Okay, this next part is where things get really interesting. The podcast dives into some of those trickier descriptors, like modest
Okay. Modest. Interesting.
and talkative.
Okay. I'm listening.
And they even touch on words like polite and rude, which are pretty loaded terms, let's be honest.
Oh, yeah.
For sure. So they use Sonia as an example. She's described as modest.
Okay. So like humble, unassuming.
Exactly. And in most cases, modesty is seen as a good thing.
Right.
Yeah. It's like
Yeah.
you don't want to be bragging all the time.
Right. But what if Sonia's modesty is actually holding her back?
Like, how so?
Like, what if she's so afraid of bragging that she downplays her accomplishment?
Ooh, that's a good point.
You know, it's like she's almost too humble for her own good.
Yeah, it's like a double-edged sword almost.
And then there's talkative, which the podcast illustrates with these characters who just love to chat.
Okay, I can relate to that.
Some people might find that endearing.
Right. Like you're never bored with them around.
But others might find it overwhelming.
I can see that too. Depends on your personality, I guess.
Totally. I'm definitely a talkative person myself, so I can relate to that.
Me too sometimes.
Yeah.
But I've definitely had people tell me I need to tone it down
Yeah.
or that I'm too much.
That's not very nice.
Yeah. But for me, talking is like how I connect with people.
I get it.
It's how I process my thoughts.
Yeah.
It's just part of who I am.
And that's totally valid.
Right. It's about recognizing that what's too much for one person might be just right for someone else.
Exactly. Different strokes for different folks, as they say.
And that brings us to an even more complex layer. Words like polite and rude.
Oh, yeah, those are tricky.
Because they're so subjective.
Totally. What one person considers rude, another person might see as just being direct or assertive.
Exactly. And it can even vary across cultures.
Oh, for sure.
Like what's considered polite in one culture might be seen as totally inappropriate in another.
100%.
It's like we all have these different unwritten rules about what's acceptable behavior.
And those rules can be really hard to navigate sometimes, especially when you're interacting with people from different backgrounds.
The podcast also briefly touches on those politically charged terms like liberal and conservative.
Oh, boy. Yeah, those are definitely loaded words.
And I think we can all agree that those are words that are often used to divide people rather than bring them together.
Yeah, they get thrown around a lot,
Mm-hmm.
but they don't really tell us much about a person.
Right. It's like we're trying to solve a complex equation using only two variables.
Exactly. It just doesn't work that way.
This podcast episode really emphasizes the importance of nuance and complexity when we're talking about personality.
I agree with that. We can't just reduce people to these simple labels.
So what's the main takeaway here? What do we hope you, dear listener, will walk away with after this deep dive? It's easy to just throw a label on someone and think you've got them figured out.
Yeah, but we have to remember that there's always more to the story.
Like those labels, easygoing, hardworking, talkative, those are just starting points.
They're not the whole picture.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
how do we bridge that gap? How do we get better at understanding people's personalities?
Well, I think it starts with curiosity. Like, instead of assuming we know everything about someone,
Based on a quick observation or a single word.
right, we need to ask questions.
And really listen to the answers.
Exactly. And be open to the possibility that our first impression might be wrong.
It's like that saying, assume makes an AS out of UNE.
Uh-huh. I love that.
It's so true. We all have a story, and those stories are way more interesting than any label.
This podcast episode really got me thinking about the stories behind the words.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like when someone's described as quiet, what does that actually mean?
Yeah. Does it mean they're shy?
Or maybe they're just really introspective.
Or maybe they're just tired of listening to everyone else.
Exactly. We have to dig deeper.
You know, it reminds me of this time I was at a conference and I met this woman who everyone described as intense.
Okay. Intense.
And at first I was kind of intimidated by her.
I can see why.
But then we started talking and I realized that her intensity was actually passion. She was just so passionate about her work and it came across as intense to some people.
It's amazing how like a simple shift in perspective can completely change how we see someone.
That's so true. And that's the power of this deep dive. It's
Yeah.
like inviting us to see the world through new lenses
To question our assumptions.
and to like approach each other with more empathy and understanding.
love that.
So, dear listener, here's your challenge for this week. Pay attention to the personality words you use.
Ooh, good one.
What do they really reveal about the people you're describing?
Are you using those words as like shortcuts?
Or are you taking the time to understand the stories behind them?
That's a great question to ponder.
And if you're really intrigued by this whole idea of personality and how it shapes our interactions,
We highly recommend checking out the full podcast episode, Understanding Personality Traits and Social Perspectives.
it's from the series Exploring Personality, and it's definitely worth a listen.
Such a great deep dive into the complexities of human nature.
And until next time, remember to stay curious. Keep those minds open and always look beyond the labels.
Great advice.
We'll catch you on our next deep dive into another fascinating topic.